Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I must say, this is my third IRC, and it has been as good as, or even better than the previous two. Not only because of the talks we've had, such as Roger's fantastic talk, and many others, but the conversations, actually. I've spent more time talking and listening, I think, continuously the last 2.5 days than any other time. So thank you, Andrew, and all of those who beget this wonderful experience. I feel my talk's rather gnarled after Roger's beautiful tapestry of meditations and thoughts, so I apologise for a bit of a sort of granity talk to follow, but it's, we are a duck rabbit, and I'm not sure, Roger, whether I'm the duck or you're the rabbit, but I suppose we can leave the audience to decide. My title is The Strange Idea That Things That Happen Have to Be Made to Happen. I can see how the idea of special divine action might be an embarrassment to theologians for many reasons, many of which have been rehearsed in this conference. Local interventions, miracles that violate the laws that God has established, supplementing, excuse me a moment, let me just talk amongst yourselves. Yeah. The great thing about a live show is the hope that something can go wrong. You know, Schadenfreude are always rules in a live show. Local interventions, miracles that violate the laws that God has established, supplementing his general action of creating and sustaining the universe as a whole, seem to demean an omnipotent, ubiquitous God. Special divine actions are patchy, capricious, and sometimes appear unjust, or at least partisan. Worse still, the belief that such actions may be prompted or influenced by prayer, ritual, or some other human communication, a notion that Roger has just looked at critically, seems to suggest that His Majesty may be biddable. The God who comes down to earth from time to time, the necessary being engaging with the contingencies of the world, is in danger of being contaminated by such ontological slumming. Worse still, the notion of special divine action implies that the universe set in motion, according to divine law, is in need of a corrective, because unforeseen or undesirable events take place. It's as if he had not anticipated imperfections in his designs. He had imperfect knowledge of his imperfect universe. The fact that divine correctives are usually occasioned by the behavior of human beings, their fallibility, foolishness, and sinfulness, does not entirely let God off the hook, if they are, after all, parts of God's creation, perhaps a supreme part of that creation made in his image. Now, a mere atheist is not in a position to comment on a topic which has been central to theological debate over thousands of years. If fools rush in where angels fear to tread, one has to be a special kind of fool to rush in where so many angels have trodden already, as Austin might have said, and I've already proved myself a less than competent theologian and biblical scholar earlier on this meeting. There is, however, a deeper worry that applies to divine action more generally, but also to all explanations of events, irrespective of whether these explanations invoke God. It is the difficulty of making sense of the notion that things happen because and only because they're made to happen. More precisely, of developing a clear idea of what would count as a complete or entirely satisfactory explanation of an event. These are background questions that vex, or should vex, an atheist as much as a theist trying to make sense of certain striking local interventions by a putative deity. So my paper is going to look beyond our specific topic of God interfering from the outside with the very machinery he set up, to consider the machinery itself and what keeps it going. And the paper is motivated by my desire to make visible the oddness of the assumption that events happen only because they're made to happen, typically courtesy of what precedes them. This is an assumption, as I've indicated, shared alike by atheists who aspire to a description of the world as an intelligible structure informed by natural law, and theists for whom the world is a scene of divine action. For both, there is the obvious difficulty that the explanatory trail breaks off at, say, a putative first event or cause. But there is a deeper and more interesting difficulty, namely that of connecting any general principle that motivates becoming or change with specific events. The embarrassment of incorporating special divine action into a theology that does not leave God diminished may be a manifestation of a broader difficulty faced by both theists and atheists, namely of connecting general possibility with inescapably singular actuality. The problem ultimately is about the origin of the local in a universe whose principles are not intrinsically local. It is the emergence of a locality that creates the explanatory gap that makes events items that require explanations. I'm going to touch on this emergence rather lightly In fact, you need to prepare yourself for some rather tentative hand-waving at the end. I say this only to make clear that I have insight into at least some of the deficiencies of my talk. Now, the idea of a compulsion by which things that happen are made to happen, indeed that they need to be made to happen, encompasses many conceptions that, while distinct, are knotted together in complex ways. The appeal to divine providence, to the principle of precedence, to inertia, to the laws of nature, to a probability, to causation, and to the agency of conscious beings capture different ways of construing what counts as a sufficient explanation of event, of becoming. They're all unsatisfactory, and I will end this talk, as I've indicated, by suggesting why it might be that we feel that events have to be made to happen in order to happen. The appeal to divine providence, to which I'll return briefly at the end of my talk, accepts simply that things happen because God wills them. If this is unsatisfactory even to non-atheists, it's not only because it leaves the idea of God's agency unclear, as we've discussed, and Colin in particular discussed, but also because it's so general, it doesn't get a purchase on particular events in a particular world. If we have the same explanation as to why a leaf falls off a tree, a friend gets over a serious illness, and a war breaks out, we have no explanation of anything in particular, and hence of anything. It is effectively to give up an explanation. So much for divine providence. Let me now turn to naturalistic explanations that don't appeal to God. First, the principle of precedence. This has many forms. One form is that an E-type event happened at time t2 because under the same conditions an E-type event happened at time t1. And this can be teased out under various slogans. Nature repeats itself. How things were, thus they will be. The unfolding world is a network of habits, and so on. The limitations of the principle of precedence are obvious, the most obvious being the lack of explanation how nature got its habits in the first place, and, once established, how and why they are maintained. One manifestation of the principle of precedence is the principle of inertia. Things carrying on as they have been carrying on, and they will do so unless something stops them. The most literal expression of this is Newton's first law of motion. Every object will continue at rest or in motion in a straight line unless acted upon by a force. Object at time t2 is travelling at speed s because it was travelling at speed s at time t1, and nothing interfered with its motion between t1 and t2. Things tend to carry on as they are unless there's some external intervention, which in the vast majority of cases will not be a conscious intervention, but merely a force. Inertia is a principle of happening or becoming that looks through or past change to an underlying stability. Effectively, nothing new is happening. What really counts, let's say velocity or momentum, or ultimately mass energy, continues the same. A state of affairs continues just as a pebble continues. A pebble does not have actually to pebble itself in order to remain in being, setting aside the fact that even a pebble is a system in dynamic equilibrium. But under this notion, continuation, in short, is a kind of second-order stasis, or non-happening. The local manifestation of inertia, which is then generalized in the law of conservation of mass energy and the fundamental invariance expressed in the laws of nature, can be extrapolated to a universe in which things happen because what is happening continues to happen. There is unchanged happening. This, of course, fails to explain many things. The appearance of change, the occurrence of profound novelties, such as, to take a couple of headlines, the emergence of life and the emergence of conscious life, and how things got going in the first place, and how there is qualitative local change in the universe, or at least the appearance of it. The principle of precedence is also implicit in the idea that the way events unfold is dictated by the relevant laws of nature, that are themselves facets of, or special cases of, certain more fundamental laws. This addresses the issue of change in a fundamentally unchanging universe. What is conserved over time is the pattern or form of change. This form is most typically captured mathematically. Event type E2 is a change that is quantitatively linked to another change, event type E1. If, for example, an applied force is doubled, the acceleration of the object to which it is applied will be doubled. If voltage is doubled, current will be doubled, ceteris paribus. What matters is the mathematical relationship between variables, and it's this that is unchanged. But this doesn't bring us closer to why happenings happen. More importantly, for the present discussion, this is because laws, being by definition general, do not reach down to whole, singular, token events. They deal only with necessarily general, necessarily partial aspects of types of events. Indeed, by the time we've ascended to the most fundamental laws, we've parted company with actual happenings entirely. The Schrödinger wave equation does not dictate that there should be any particular events involving particular quantities of actual qualities, something to which I'll return. There is, as it were, no legislative power in the laws. At best, they are constraints, defining the range of possibility. Railway lines rather than locomotives. At any rate, they require a substrate, which is clearly distinct from the laws themselves. Additionally, there is the contingent nature of the laws. Although this contingent nature seems to be concealed as long as there are higher order laws under which the lower ones can be subsumed. These lower ones then carry the burden of contingency. But also there's the contingency of the nakedly arbitrary physical constants. And there is the most profound problem, willfully overlooked in some current scientific cosmogony, that laws applying to the totality cannot be in place prior to the existence of anything at all. More precisely, the stuff that has come into being cannot be explained by the laws that operate within it once it has come into being. The railway timetable does not bring the railway system into being or even exist before the railways. Yet another manifestation of the principle of precedence is the notion that events happen because they have a greater probability of happening than any of the other rival possibilities. The range of possibilities and the relative probability of each of these possibilities in different kinds of circumstance will reflect or continue already established patterns of occurrence. The appeal to probability as explanation is, of course, unsatisfactory in many ways. Probabilities are derived from established patterns of prior events, which themselves remain unexplained. What is more, actual events, which will always have unique features, will have negligible probabilities, so they cannot be selected by general probabilities. Finally, it's clear that probabilities, even if they were extra-mental realities, something denied by some, do not have any locomotive or creative power. They don't make things happen. They seem to be irredeemably post hoc. Any explanation of happening, however, will have to explain the preceding hoc. The appeal to different aspects of the principle of precedence, inertia, or the habit of continuation, laws of nature and probability, does not therefore seem to provide anything that answers to our intuition that what happens has been made to happen. There has to be some kind of nudge or oomph to bring things about, or at least to give happening a steer. The notion that most closely answers to the demand for making happen is that of a cause. Things happen because they are caused by events that precede them. Causes seem to be imbued with the powers that laws lack. At the very least, they correspond to the common sense notion, elaborated in physical science, of the transfer of energy and impetus. They also have the requisite local jurisdiction. The notion of cause, however, as I guess everybody in the room knows, deeply problematic, and the philosophical literature is consequently vast, subtle, and inconclusive. And I'm going to touch on it only lightly, and I'm afraid David Hume is the inescapable first port of call. Notoriously for Hume, the necessary connection between events embodied in the idea of causes bringing about effects is simply a projection of the expectations built up in our minds as a result of experiencing the associations between events. We come, incorrectly, to believe that A is caused by B if when A occurs, B invariably follows, at least under certain fixed or defined or controlled conditions. However, Hume argued, we have no good reason to believe that our habits of expectation correspond to any external reality, any external necessity, hence the vulnerability of induction. According to Kant, Hume's reduction of causation to mental association shocked him into making an even more radical suggestion. Not only is the necessity in the relationship between cause and effect mind-dependent, but also the items thus linked, the events, the objects caught up in them, the space in which they take place, and the time in which they occur. While causation, he says, is a key element in our sense of a coherent world of enduring objects located in space and time, it does not belong to an extramental natural world, the noumenal reality, the in itself. Now, many philosophers in the analytical tradition have accepted Hume's critique of cause as a necessary connection, as a kind of his critique of the notion of an occult force, but have been disinclined to subscribe to Kantian idealism. And I guess this is what has in part inspired the rather etiolated idea of causes as counterfactuals. It's worth glancing at, not because it has any intrinsic merits, but because what is missing in the counterfactual account of causation reminds us by default of what we seek in a causal explanation, the kind of explanatory satisfaction we're looking for. According to the counterfactual theory, A counts as a cause of B, and B as its effect if B would not have occurred in the absence of the prior occurrence of A. The lightning is the cause of thunder if the thunder would not occur in the absence of the lightning. This account of cause does avoid some of the problems associated with the idea of a cause as something that will guarantee and be responsible for an effect. Consider, for example, this problem, first invoked by Kant. If A is going to be sufficient to cause B, it seems that it will have to be commensurate with it, perhaps to the point of being coterminous with it, and even equal to it in salient ways, the problem of Kant's cushion. This gets dangerously close to the idea that in order for a cause to be entirely adequate to bring about its effect, it has to be identical with it. The redescription of causes as counterfactuals, however, seems to take away their oomph. Causative power to bring things about, to make happenings happen, is dissipated into something like a description of circumstance. And remember, even non-events can now qualify as counterfactual causes. The lack of rain can count as the cause of the withering of flowers, since if it had rained, the flowers would not have withered. The counterfactual theory is particularly compromised by the unresolved problem of differentiating causes from what are merely the background conditions necessary for causes to operate. Counterfactual theory doesn't distinguish that which permits from that which motors particular happenings. What separates the mere conditions of an event from the cause that brings it about may be the salience of the latter, reflecting the fact we look for causes when events stick out, because perhaps they are surprising. They seem to deviate from the norm. One obvious criterion of salience is that the cause is an occurrent while its conditions are standing. So the air, whose counterfactual absence would mean that lightning would not result in thunder, counts as a condition rather than a cause, a stage setting for the event rather than the power that brings it about. Salience is not satisfactorily integrated into the counterfactual theory, but it is at the heart of another leading contemporary notion of causation, the agency or manipulability theory. Causes, as events that bring about other events, have this capacity, it is argued, in view of being handles which agents may grasp to bring about effects. A is the cause of B if I can bring about B by bringing about A. A is salient because B, the effect, is picked out as something that I want to make happen. This intuition is also at work when our identification of the cause of an event is connected with the task of allocating responsibility, apportioning blame, as in a court of law. We may define the cause of an event as a state of affairs which should have been avoided by means of a handle that should have been seized through which the agent could assert power. Unfortunately, as I guess many will be aware of, the manipulability theory of causation has many problems. The most obvious is that we think of causation as being extended to places where no conscious agent has trodden. For example, a rock falling to the ground on an unvisited planet, cause, breaking another rock, effect. Agency, by living matter, or more precisely by human agents, can at best explain only a very small and recent subset of events in the universe. What is more, if an agent X causes event B by bringing about event A, we then have to explain bringing about A, and all those events that created the circumstances in which it is possible to bring about A. I may smash a window by deliberately throwing a stone, but I do not will or do all the physiological events necessary for my intention to be realized and my agency to be effective. Even so, deliberate action seems to be the paradigm of events brought about by other events. So much so that some philosophers suggested that the very idea of causation has grown out of our sense of agency. This is clearly not the whole story, given that we accept that science, or some other form of inquiry has and will uncover causal patterns remote from agency, that there are both real and apparent causes, and that successful agency itself seems to depend on causal relations that agents are unaware of. In short, that agents operate in a universe of events that are overwhelmingly not brought about by agents, and so the capacity of agents to make things happen is unexplained, and what is more, irrelevant to whatever it is, if anything, that makes most happenings happen. However, the experience of agency may underline our sense that whatever happens does so because it is made to happen. That being made to happen is a kind of explanation, and that without being made to happen, either by previous events or as part of an already ongoing process, happening is unacceptably unexplained or insufficiently occasioned. At any rate, it is here that the concerns of atheists converge with those of theists. The intuition that things happen only if they are made to happen, the necessity of causation, is shared by both parties, and both have to deal with the difficulties inherent in this intuition, though they are somewhat different for atheists and theists. Most obviously, we both have to acknowledge that the chain of making happen must originate from something that was not made to happen, some initial act or event that happened without cause or because, without precedent or existing law, without being the continuation of something already ongoing. Godless cosmogony tries to finesse this difficulty by invoking items such as the instability in the quantum vacuum, a fidgety nothing living on borrowed energy that gets an up and running universe by means of a mighty credit default swap. Those who are not so dazzled by the physics as to believe it can do metaphysics are unimpressed, and that includes me. Theists, of course, have a universal answer as why things happen. Happenings and the substrate in which they happen were made to happen by God. Leaving aside the impression for an atheist that God simply marks a place where explanation is required without such an explanation being forthcoming, like giving the word answer as an answer to a question, there are many other problems. The most relevant to this talk, and I hope this conference, is this: an absolutely general explanation, such as divine agency, does not have traction on particular events. There are no sufficient local explanations, the kinds of explanations that actual circumscribed events require, if all explanations point to a common origin, as is the case with divine agency. But it's rarely recognized that this disability is shared by the most fundamental scientific explanations. If we look to absolutely fundamental, simple laws for explanation, we will be left unable to explain the origin of a differentiated world in which A happens rather than B, or A happens as well as B. To put this more precisely, the very general explanation, that is the ultimate expression of the uniformity of nature, does not allow for a non-uniform, differentiated universe evolving over time. Generality cannot capture, even less prescribe, or bring about what happens in localities. So we have two unsatisfactory narratives: the atheist narrative that things happen on account of the laws of nature, probability or causation or whatever, and the theistic one that things happen because they're willed by God. Now, the thesis towards which I'm progressing is that theistic and atheistic world pictures have similar problems in explaining events, in identifying what it is in the most general sense that make happenings happen. This may be the only justification for conflating the two approaches, the theological and the scientific, with the fundamental equations being described as a portrait of the mind of God by certain scientists, so that for a short while Stephen Hawking felt that he was that in virtue of which God gained insight into himself. More seriously then, they share the same problem of connecting local events with general explanations. So while the problem with special divine action may be that God demeans himself by interceding or acting in a particular place, in a particular manner, that deviates from what was prescribed by his founding principles, the deeper problem is that of remaining within the original prospectus, whether it's scientific or theistic, while ensuring that actual, that is to say, particular events happen. This disconnection between the general explanation and the specific explanandum is common, as I say, to theistic and naturalistic accounts of the unfolding world. I'm entirely sure that I'm not qualified to characterize how this is manifested on the theistic side, but I would like to venture that the embarrassment caused by the notion of special divine action is that it is local. It is the origin of localities that is a problem, given that God is seamless and his creation undivided, and he undivided from his creation. This betrays how the notion of divine agency offers an explanation of the totality of events at the cost of an explanation that makes contact with actual explananda that are inescapably as local as human needs, concerns, and the need for explanation. So long as we look at the creation as a whole, there's no explanatory gap because there is no universe of discrete entities to be linked up. But as soon as we get down and dirty among the actual, that is to say local events, then we have trouble. And this is, I guess, the motivation for the doctrine of occasionalism, according to which everything that happens is the product of specific, if not special, divine action, because everything that is specific seems to require specific agency because actual events are singular and are somehow both exceed and fall short of general laws. Scientific explanations seem to become more complete and satisfying as we ascend from actual local events in actual localities, from empirical observations to general laws, and from general laws to more general laws, and ultimately to fundamental equations. Unfortunately, as we do so, the occurrence of particular events or the reality of particular beings becomes less explained. This tension is illustrated by the difficult relationship between causal and law-based explanations of particular events. Causes provide local oomph, but no general explanation, and laws provide general explanation, but no local oomph. The idea that particular causes may be expressions of general laws applies only to type causal interactions. Events, however, are tokens, and as such are not entirely captured by general laws. Nothing that actually happens can be prescribed by general laws. Or to express the obverse of this, everything that happens goes beyond and falls short of the general laws of nature. And this is surprisingly acknowledged by Richard Feynman in one of his late lectures. Speaking of the Schrödinger wave equation, he said that the next great awakening of the human intellect may well produce a method of understanding the qualitative content of equations. Today, we cannot see whether Schrödinger's equation contains frogs, musical composers, or morality, or whether it does not. It seems to me that scientific explanation tends towards a blank as complete as that of an apophatic God. We arrive at a handful of equations in which there are no localities, no local interactions, no local entities, no actual events. En route to this terminus, fields and forces gradually replace things that can be grasped and located over here and over there, until we end with the notion of the universe as a single wave function. Let's imagine that this scientific portrait of the universe were true. We would have the idea of a seamlessly unfolding universe with no gap, and hence no explanatory gap, between successive moments and successive states and events. We would then have to explain the origin of localities composed of distinct items that then have to be connected with their own prior and posterior states and with the states of other localities. Now a health warning, wild speculation alert, or a bit of Kant light, you might call it. We would find, I would suggest, we'd find this in the eruption of individual self-consciousness into the universe. Each of us is the center of egocentric space. And while we are here, and others are there. There is near and far, now and then, and so on. The disintegration of the world and the emergence of gaps, which eventually present as explanatory gaps, is connected with the emergence of individual self-consciousness, with individual consciousnesses that have needs that organize the world around them and identify salient and non-salient features. Is it this loosening of the texture of the totality, opened up by a self-consciousness, that lies at the root of the apparent need for happenings to be made to happen? I don't know, of course. If it were the case, it would be an interesting irony that the direction of ever more powerful scientific explanations as to why happenings happen tend towards the erasure of the very consciousness that prompted the need for explanation to reconnect the world in the first place. But, opened up, sprung apart, the universe cannot be put together again. The majestically unfolding totality, without any requirement for explanation, local oomph, or intervention, or guidance, would then pose questions as to what makes individual happenings happen, questions to which no satisfactory, even less a complete answer, could be found. Well, I promised you tentative hand-waving at the end of my talk, and I don't think I've let you down, but it's time now to draw back to safer territory. Theists and atheists are both in the business of trying to explain how it is that happenings happen. This inquiry is motivated by the intuition that what happens has to be made to happen, typically by happenings that precede them. Such explanations, however, are unsatisfactory, not only because they leave something unexplained, the laws, the probability patterns, the habits of nature, the agency of a deity, first causes and so on, but also because they ascend away from the very places where the need for explanation arises. If special divine action is a problem against the background of universal divine agency, individual events are equally problematic in a universe whose definitive scientific portrait is in equations that capture what is unchanging, equations which lack substance or substrate to operate on or within. We atheists, ladies and gentlemen, therefore have no more grounds for smugness as we watch theists struggle with the idea of a God intervening in his own creation, descending from ubiquity to localities. If I remain an atheist, it's not because I believe atheists have better answers than the theists, and I recognize that the search for a fundamental, final answer to the question of what it is that makes happening happen is doomed, self-contradictory, inasmuch as advances in explanation take us further from that which they are to explain. Ultimately, explanation has to remain in touch with the localities where the need for it arises. But the more fundamental the explanation, the more it is disconnected from any particular explanandum. Causal explanation remains local at a common sense level, but has explanatory power only if its instances are seen to express very general laws, and so gradually to lose touch with the local, the particular, and the actual. The fact that this is a truism doesn't make it any less true, or I hope less interesting. Thank you for your attention, or at least for the courtesy of simulating it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. We have a few minutes now for questions. Let's wait for the microphone to reach you. There are two here, almost simultaneous. Perhaps Daniel first, and then Len.
Thank you, Daniel von Wachter. You assumed that an explanation in terms of divine agency would be general. I think you even said absolutely general. That seems wrong to me. It's a singular explanation. It's the most singular one you can get. It's the one in terms of one cause just acting at one time. I mean, the same cause can act several times, but it is a singular explanation. And if you're worried about the relationship between singular and general explanations, I think you should be a theist, because then you have an ultimate explanation for everything that is singular.
I've written on the first part of the question, so I'll have to ask the second part in a second. You say you have one cause operating, but we have a multiplicity of effects which are utterly different. The normal use of cause is that the effects are in some sense proportionate to the cause and that they are tailored to the cause. When you have a cause that's utterly general, it seems to me, and this is dangerous territory, talking theology, that you have difficulty in explaining the extraordinary variety and variousness of the effects.
It's the same thing doing many causes. There is no problem with that. We have that very often. It will only be the very same. I mean, and you can have a complex action too, if you prefer to put it that way. In any case, there is no problem with one agent producing many different effects.
I mean, obviously, I'm playing an away match here, but all I'm saying, if we think of the use of the term cause within, say, my own naturalistic, well, my own atheistic perspective, then I would expect differentiated effects to be produced by differentiated causes. It seems to me that God is undifferentiated, and you would expect, therefore, his effects to be undifferentiated. But it may not be the case. I'm not going to the stake on theology. I've already made a prat of myself in that respect. Yeah.
Professor Lengelman.
Thank you. I thought these were two very beautiful and very brilliant papers, and we all are in your debt to both of you. I have a question for Ray Tallis. I want to appreciate what you said about how the general doesn't reach to the particular, and at the same time, the kind of category error which is I think one of the sins of modern science, of eliminating the notion of cause in favor of the notion of general laws. And we have to notice that general laws aren't things at all, and therefore can't be causes, and as you eloquently put it, don't have any oomph. I'm a fan of the idea of causes, and I think they need and deserve a resuscitation. But I wonder, with regard to the issue of the failure of the very general to reach down to the level of particularity. First of all, I think that resonates with Aristotle's criticism of Plato. The form of the good doesn't explain all the different things, the variety of things we have around us, and that's one of the reasons why in studying nature we need to be empiricists. We can't do it deductively or from our dreams and memories. Still, I think the idea that God becomes somehow too isolated from the world to be a causal explanation may neglect the feature of God that people rely upon, which is not so much, I think, to explain the particularity and differentiation of things, as to explain the inherent goodness of reality. If there are values in reality, whether it's goodness or beauty or truth, which we think are all united in that ultimate value, which has been called the one or the truth or the good, that's the kind of thing that a general explanation, a general law of the sort that Hawking and others were looking for, is not even equipped to examine, let alone to identify once found. That's what I think the theist is looking for. So you've got your system of general laws, and they ought to, I think you and I might agree, they ought to be pointing to causes and not just to principles. But beyond those general laws and that sort of causality, shouldn't it be right and legitimate for the theist to be looking for the source of value inherent in being? That's my question.
I mean, that's never been the ambition of science, of course.
No,
and
nor
very
should
early
it
on
be.
in the
Nor
scientific...
should it be.
And
Nor
very
should
early-
it be ignored by the scientist who notices the beauty of things and values theories for their elegance and values truth for its own sake.
Right.
But if you think at the beginning of the scientific revolution, Galileo clearly separated primary from secondary qualities, and primary qualities are those essentially that ultimately reduced to numbers. And secondary qualities were those reduced to subjective experiences. Once that separation had been made, there was going to follow a separation of significance was over there, and value was over there, and science over here. And it is very clear that in the more complete our scientific portrait of the world becomes, the more it will seem empty. And I quote Stephen Weinberg on this, who said, the more we understand the universe, the more meaningless it seems. What he really means is the more you understand the universe solely through quantitative science, then of course it will seem to be meaningless. So it's very true, we lose an awful lot as we ascend to generality. And that's why obviously one likes homely little causes like, the lightning was caused, the thunder was caused by the lightning. But of course, one wants to know more. But as you know more, you seem also to lose existential weight, to lose content, and so on. Yeah.
What I'm proposing is that there's an impoverishment as a result of that divorce. The idea that value is only subjective is a misrepresentation not only of value, but a misrepresentation of being at large.
I think on that point we better move on to the next question, but thank you very much. I've got two more, so there's a gentleman at the back there, please.
Thank you for both of your talks. I want to reiterate, I forget the fellow here's name. I wanted to reiterate his sentiment that you should be a theist.
Professor Tallis.
There's a notion that I'll probably not be able to express that, Christ is not only this person, but he is the full revelation of God and the full revelation of man and the full revelation of creation. So he's the first principle of creation. This is in Maximus the Confessor. Christ as cosmic principle, or I'm paraphrasing. And so on that notion, we should not only think about Jesus, which, you know, people tend to do, even non-Christians, but we should think along Jesus. We should think with Jesus. We should use that cosmic principle, if you will, to think about anything else. Think incarnationally.
So what question would you like to pose to him?
Thank you. So Jesus is described as the speech. I'm wondering how speech fits into your causal, your list. Is speech just reducible to agency, or is it a different kind of cause? Because I'm causing you to think about certain things right now.
Speech. I'm not too sure I can answer the question, because I can't entirely see how it relates, but let me just think. I mean, clearly, Roger, I heard your intake of breath. You were going to respond.
Well,
yes.
The answer is, in the beginning was the word. So speech is the answer to your question.
So that's answer with a capital A.
Thank you, Duck, from the rabbit.
Okay, we're going to move on to this. Professor Susan Eastman. We're waiting there. Thank you.
Truly beautiful talks from both of you. Thank you so much. This is a question actually for Roger, if that's allowed at this point. Very, very briefly, you talked about needing to understand what we can ask for. And I found myself thinking of Romans 8, where Paul says we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit intercedes for us according to the will of God, and God who searches the hearts knows what the Spirit is saying. There's a sense in which prayer has an inarticulate quality there, explicitly. So I wonder, and the role of the Holy Spirit comes into play in prayer. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
What are my thoughts on this? It's obviously it's a new topic for me in a way. Although, of course, like everybody else, I find myself in situations where prayer seems to be the obvious and only thing. But I suppose I would reiterate the fact that through prayer we're not just asking for things, we're preparing the creature who asks. And that creature who asks is not given to me a priori. He is built precisely through activities of this kind. As I understand it, the fully consecrated life is a life of prayer of exactly that kind, in which is a constant preparation.
Thank you. We're just drawing to a close. I'd like to just make a final, express final thanks to Ray. He seems to have a knack for finding an appropriate metaphor which gets to the heart of a problem. I very much like this idea of causal oomph, which throws into contrast a very bloodless way analytic philosophers that I know often talk about causation. So thank you for just highlighting that. I was reminded also of a comment made by Newton when asked, or when considering the problem of how action at a distance is actually caused, so beautifully described by the equations of gravity. And he said, I do not feign hypotheses. So thank you for drawing attention to that distinction once again.
Thank you.